everyone. Thanks for joining us for our speaker series meeting today. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tania Lombrozo, who is the Arthur W. Marks Professor of Psychology at Princeton University, where she has led the Concepts and Cognition Lab since, I think, 2018. And before that, she was a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley, all the way on the other side of the country. Her professional honors and awards are legion. She has been an ACLS fellow. She has received funding from the National Science Foundation multiple times, and she has been recognized for her contributions to psychological science by numerous professional societies, such as the Society for Experimental Psychology, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Psychological Association. And in addition to being a first-rate research psychologist, Dr. Lombrozo also has a background in philosophy, and believe it or not, she even enjoys working with philosophers from time to time. I know it's somewhat incredible, but it's true. And unsurprisingly, given her love of philosophy in addition to psychology, she is associated faculty at Princeton's Department of Philosophy, as well as Princeton's University Center for Human Values. Professor Lombrozo was a co-principal investigator on JTF's Varieties of Understanding project, which was a $3.5 million interdisciplinary endeavor aimed at investigating the nature of understanding. And right now, she's the project leader on a JTF-sponsored project entitled When and Why We Explain: The Need for Explanation and Tolerance for Mystery in Science and Religion. This is about $500,000, and it's aimed at investigating how explanations in science and in religion compare and contrast with one another. And I believe she will be sharing some of that work this morning. So Professor Lombrozo, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us here at JTF.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Alex, for that introduction. I will be sharing some of my work related to the grant that you just mentioned. So first, let me share my screen so that you can see some of my slides. All right, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides okay? Excellent, thank you so much. Well, first, I just again want to thank you and thanks the Templeton Foundation, both for the funding for this work and also for inviting me to share it with you today. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to join your community, albeit virtually at the moment. So today I'm going to be telling you about some of my research, which has to do with explanation and ignorance in science and religion. But as you'll see in a moment, I think I probably should have labeled my presentation Ideal Believers, because what I want to do is start with a thought experiment. And what I would like you to do is to imagine that you have been tasked with endowing the next generation of advanced intelligence with an ideal system of beliefs. So I want you to take a moment to think about, what is it that an ideal believer would believe? How would an ideal believer form and revise her beliefs? And what would it even mean for a belief or a belief formation process to be ideal? So one way to approach this kind of question is to consider the beliefs and processes for forming our beliefs that would make this intelligent system the most likely to end up with an accurate representation of the world. So you might think of this as a broadly kind of epistemic goal. What you want to do is to be able to acquire knowledge, to be able to track the truth, and have veridical representations. And this is a broadly kind of epistemic goal that you might imagine. So for this kind of a believer, the way that you might think about ideal beliefs is that our belief should have characteristics like being based on evidence and being based on logic. You might think that they should accurately describe the kinds of causal processes or mechanisms that operate in the world, and so on. And for this believer, processes for acquiring and revising our beliefs would aim to construct an accurate representation or model of the world. So you'd expect a positive attitude towards inquiry, and you'd expect something like ignorance to be treated as a call to action, right? Evidence that our model is not yet fully complete, that there's more to learn. But this epistemic believer doesn't offer the only way that you might be thinking about ideal belief. So a very different way to approach ideal belief is to consider a different goal. So suppose our believer's goal isn't only to achieve epistemic ends, but to instead achieve social and moral ends. Suppose that our believer wants to be a good friend, a cooperative partner, a force for good, and so on. So for this believer, the best beliefs are going to be those that support these broadly non-epistemic kinds of goals. And ideal beliefs for this believer would likely have characteristics like supporting one's loved ones, promoting moral behavior, and so on. So for this believer, processes for acquiring and revising beliefs would aim to achieve ends like signaling loyalty, respect, and identity, perhaps fostering partnerships, and so on. So it's not obvious that for this believer, inquiry would always be desirable or that ignorance would always be regarded as a failing. So in today's presentation, what I want to suggest is that humans are both epistemic and non-epistemic believers. And this in itself is definitely not a new claim. So the idea that human beliefs are shaped by both epistemic and non-epistemic considerations has been documented in experimental psychology for quite a long time. And it's also something that's just been recognized more broadly in the history of ideas. What's new is how I'm going to investigate the epistemic and non-epistemic dimensions of belief. So in the work that I'm going to tell you about today, I and my collaborators have been looking at two very different domains of belief that plausibly differ along epistemic and non-epistemic dimensions. Specifically, we've been studying scientific belief and cognition and religious belief and cognition, focusing on the beliefs, explanations, and attitudes towards inquiry in each of these domains. And based on this work, I'm going to argue for a form of functional differentiation, where scientific cognition has a profile that more closely aligns with an epistemic believer, whereas religious cognition has a profile that more closely aligns with a non-epistemic believer. So this doesn't mean that some individuals are epistemic believers and that other individuals are non-epistemic believers. And it also doesn't mean that all individuals are both epistemic and non-epistemic, informing and revising all of their beliefs to the same extent. So instead, the idea is that different kinds of cognitive activities are going to be more or less aligned with epistemic and non-epistemic aims, such that the very same person might adopt different kinds of criteria for evaluating and revising beliefs, depending on the type of cognitive activity in which they're engaged. And my claim is going to be that scientific and religious cognition tend to differ in this regard, with scientific cognition taking a more epistemic kind of flavor and religious cognition a more non-epistemic flavor, even within the very same person. So if this is true, I think it's important for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it's going to help explain how it is that we balance epistemic and non-epistemic goals, because often these will be compatible, but there's times when these can actually pull us in different directions. So having different kinds of cognitive capacities that are tailored to different goals is going to allow us to be more flexible thinkers and believers, able to navigate a broader range of human concerns. So at this point, we have 5 projects that have been funded under this grant that all investigate epistemic and non-epistemic dimensions of scientific and religious cognition. And each of these involves multiple studies. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to explain all of that here today in our brief time. So what I've decided to do is to try to take a tour through some of this by picking out 4 highlights from this research. And I'm going to present the results of just those highlights today. So in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some results related to belief. In particular, these are going to bear on how it is that people justify beliefs across the domains of science and religion. There we go. And how it is that people evaluate explanations from these 2 domains. So don't worry about reading through the text here for now. I'm going to go through this more slowly in a moment. I just want to give you an overview before we launch in. I do want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work, who have been Emlyn Metz, Emily Liquin, and Telly Debuti. In the second part of the presentation, I'm going to turn to belief formation, including attitudes towards inquiry and attitudes towards ignorance across both of these domains. And for this work, my collaborators also include Maureen Gill. Before moving on, I do want to just note that all of these studies were conducted with predominantly Christian participants in the United States. And so when I talk about religion and religious belief, I'm really talking about a very specific type of religious belief in this particular community. So I think an important question is the extent to which these findings will generalize, and that's something I'd be really happy to talk about in the Q&A. All right, so the first study that I'm going to show you addressed people's justifications for belief across the domains of science and religion. And in this work, what we show is that people on average more strongly favor epistemic justifications for belief compared to religious belief, for scientific belief, sorry, compared to religious belief, and non-epistemic justifications for religious belief compared to scientific belief. So here's how we did this. In our first study in this series, we asked participants to consider a variety of possible justifications for some claim. Some participants were asked to consider a scientific claim, some to consider a religious claim, and some didn't have the domain specified at all. So they were just told to imagine reasons to accept a claim as true. And what they were what we asked them to do was to tell us how good various possible justifications for belief were. So here's a subset of the justifications that they were asked to evaluate. And so for each of these, what they would do is rate them on a 4-point scale, from being a very poor reason for accepting a claim as true to being an excellent reason for accepting a claim as true. And the reasons that we gave our participants fell into 6 categories that are labeled here on the left, although they were not explicitly labeled like this for participants. So just to give you some examples, a scientific justification for accepting something as true might be that there's good scientific evidence for it. A religious justification might be that it's in scripture. A heart-based justification would be that you feel it in your gut or that it feels true in your heart. An ethical justification would be that believing it encourages people to be good, and so on. So what we were interested in was to what extent people would think that these were good justifications for belief, and whether and how that might vary across the domain of the belief. Okay, so here's what we found. And the way I'm going to show you the data is that I've collapsed across those different categories of justifications on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is how strongly participants endorsed that justification for a given claim, where higher numbers are better, right? Indicating that that's a better reason to endorse a particular belief. And the baseline condition is the condition in which we didn't specify the domain of the belief. So participants were just generically asked to imagine that they were evaluating a claim. How good would these reasons be for taking the claim to be true? And what you can see is that overall, they thought that the scientific justifications were very good. They thought the explanatory justifications were pretty good. And for the remaining claims, you got sort of more modest ratings about how good those were as bases for belief. When you add the scientific claims, what you can see is that we get almost the exact same ratings, which suggests that when we didn't specify a domain, the default for how we think about belief was very similar to how we think about justifying a scientific belief. For religious belief, though, which is indicated here in this green line, we see some interesting departures from both the baseline condition and also from the case where we told people to consider a scientific belief. So not surprisingly, people think that a religious justification is better for religious belief, and there's a weaker effect whereby they think that scientific evidence is less good in supporting a religious belief. But I think the most interesting results are that they also think that ethical and heart-based justifications are more appropriate for religious beliefs than for scientific or unspecified beliefs. And recall that the ethical justifications are things like, this helps people be moral, the world would be a more moral place if people believe this. And the heart-based criteria were things like, it feels true in my heart, or I know in my gut that it's true. So we've extended this finding in a few ways. So first, we've replicated these patterns for specific scientific and religious claims. So rather than just telling people to consider a scientific claim or religious claim, we find a particular scientific claim or religious claim that that participant actually endorses. And we match the strength of endorsement across those 2 domains, and then see what people consider to be good justifications for belief, and we replicate these same trends. And we've also asked people to rate justifications for belief for politicized scientific claims. So things like climate change, GMOs, and vaccines. And what we find in these cases is that people who endorse the scientific consensus on these views, so for example, that humans are partially responsible for climate change, they tend to rate justifications just like our red line for generic science claims. But the participants who reject the scientific consensus on these issues tend to rate these claims more like the religious claims in that they think ethical justifications and some of these other criteria play a larger role. So this suggests that the profile for belief isn't just a function of the content of a claim, but it also reflects the kind of attitude or the form of cognition that one adopts towards that content, right? The kind of broader psychological role that it might be playing for that individual. So these first studies offer some preliminary evidence that scientific and religious belief might be treated differently along epistemic and non-epistemic dimensions, with science more strongly tied to epistemic kinds of considerations and religion featuring a larger role for moral and other kinds of considerations. These data also suggest that you can hold a belief that has scientific content, like some belief about anthropogenic climate change, but you can do so with a non-scientific kind of attitude, one that brings in considerations beyond what you might think of as sort of narrowly evidential ones. And presumably you could endorse a religious content with a more scientific attitude, although that's not something that we see here in these data. All right, so the second set of findings that I want to share with you concerns the evaluation of scientific and religious explanations. And specifically, I'm going to show you some evidence that people attribute more epistemic virtues to scientific explanations than to religious explanations, and conversely, more non-epistemic virtues to religious explanations and to scientific explanations. So for this project, we wanted a domain of explanation where people might offer both scientific and religious explanations. And so what we did is focus on existential questions. So specifically, we had people consider answers to questions like, how did the universe come to exist? Why is there suffering in the world? And what happens after we die? We had hundreds of participants offer answers to these questions. And then we had other participants read through those explanations and classify them as religious, scientific, both, or neither. And then we took the answers to those questions that were consistently classified as just religious and considered those our religious explanations, or that were consistently classified as just scientific, and we considered those to be our scientific explanations. So that we can then use those as our stimulus materials to ask whether or not there's any differences in how people evaluate those two different sets of explanations. So to assess that, what we did is that we presented this final set of explanations to new sets of participants. And every participant received just one explanation, and we had them rate that explanation along a bunch of dimensions that are indicated here on the x-axis. And I'm not going to walk you through all of the dimensions and all of the items that we used, but I do want to give you a flavor for what it is that we were measuring here. So for example, the epistemic dimensions included things like whether an explanation was based on evidence, and whether it was objective in the sense that it was right for everybody versus being right for some people, but not for others. We also, for these dimensions, the more epistemic ones, what we found was that on average, people gave much higher ratings to the scientific explanations than to the religious explanations. So that's the sort of orange bars being higher here, the scientific explanations, and to the religious explanations here in black. But for the non-epistemic items, we looked at a variety of other kinds of dimensions that you might care about for explanations. And these included things like emotional comfort, for example, in the form of offering peace of mind, offering insight into oneself, helping make the world a more moral place, and so on. And for most of these items, what we found was the reverse. So for all but one of these dimensions, we found that on average, our participants gave higher ratings to the religious explanations here in black than to the scientific explanations here in, I'm not sure if that's orange or yellow. I'm going to say orange. So perhaps not surprisingly, we did find that the way that participants rated these explanations depended on their own level of religiosity, which you can imagine is a kind of proxy for whether or not they accept that religious explanation is true. So here's the data from one representative epistemic dimension and one representative non-epistemic dimension. These are the same data that I just showed you, but now I'm plotting it as a function of an individual's own religiosity. So along the x-axis, you have religiosity from 1 to 4. 4 means someone indicated they were very religious, and 1 is that they're not religious at all. There we go. So for the participants who are more religious, corresponding to the higher numbers on the x-axis, we find that scientific and religious explanations were actually not differentiated along epistemic dimensions. And I think this could be because religious participants do take themselves to have good justifications for their belief, as we saw in part 1. But it may be that those justifications might not take the form of something like scientific evidence. Instead, they might include things like the ethical considerations that we just talked about, or heart-based considerations, or personal religious experience. But we did see that the most religious participants strongly differentiated science and religion along non-epistemic dimensions. So despite the epistemic similarity, here we have evidence for functional differentiation along the non-epistemic dimensions. If we look at the least religious participants, we see that they differentiated science and religion along the epistemic dimensions. So that's where you're getting a lot of functional differentiation. However, for these participants, there were not differences in how they rated science and religion along the non-epistemic dimensions. And that's because they gave low ratings to both of them. So I think this raises the really interesting question of how, if at all, the non-religious participants in our sample satisfied non-epistemic goals like the ones we've been considering in the context of answering existential questions. So if they don't do so through scientific or religious explanations, how are they fulfilling those roles, if at all? So in part to answer that question, we conducted an additional study in which we asked participants to answer one of our 3 existential questions that you already saw, but we explicitly instructed them to provide an explanation that meets non-epistemic goals, like offering peace of mind and comfort, or one that meets epistemic goals, like being based on evidence and logic. As a control condition to have a sort of baseline, we asked participants just to offer an explanation that's clear and grammatical. And the hope here was not to bias them towards epistemic or non-epistemic, but rather just to see what they offer in this context spontaneously. So first, we were interested in whether this would shift the probability with which participants would offer a religious versus a scientific explanation. And in fact, that is what we found. So what you can see is how scientific and religious these explanations were rated by participants themselves, although we replicated this with our own experimenter codings. And what you can see is that the black bars, which are belonging to the domain of religion, we saw an increase in religious explanations in the non-epistemic condition compared to the other 2. And the I'm going to say they're gold. The gold bars are science, and you can see that in the epistemic condition, we had people offering more scientific explanations than they did in the other 2 conditions. But we were also specifically interested in what was going on in the non-epistemic condition. So in particular, how were non-religious participants succeeding, if at all, in offering comfort and peace of mind through their explanations to these existential questions? So what we did is that we coded all of the explanations in all conditions to see whether they offered anything like a source of comfort or peace of mind, and if so, whether they did so in a way that was religious, scientific, or neither. So here's what we found, and I'm just going to focus on the main bars here because we had several coding categories. So first, focus on the gray, and that corresponds to sources of comfort that were coded as supernatural or religious. So they might include, for example, after death, being reunited with your loved ones in heaven. And what you can see is that these explanations were much more common in the non-epistemic condition compared to the other conditions. But you'll also see that a lot of the explanations that were offered in the non-epistemic condition offered what we called natural sources of comfort. So these explanations included things like the idea that after death, we live on, but in the memories of our loved ones, or that we are an important part of the universe, that we're made of stardust and part of something that's much bigger than ourselves. So these explanations were rarely classified as explicitly scientific or religious. So while our non-religious participants were readily able to generate explanations for the existential that had non-epistemic virtues, they rarely did so by explicitly appealing to science, whereas our religious participants often did so. All right, so I've now shown you some ways in which scientific and religious beliefs tend to differ in their justification and in their evaluation and in the generation of different kinds of explanations in response to different kinds of epistemic and non-epistemic demands. I now want to turn to attitudes towards learning and revising beliefs, specifically focusing on inquiry and ignorance. So the first project here investigates attitudes towards inquiry across science and religion, showing that seeking evidence and explanation is seen as a sign of commitment to science, whereas in some cases, abdicating from evidence and explanation regarding religious matters is seen as a sign of commitment to religion. So part of the motivation for this project was the observation that at least some religious traditions seem to place value on belief in the absence of evidence or inquiry. And sometimes this is referred to as believing on faith. So one illustration is the story of doubting Thomas, who refused to believe that Jesus had been resurrected until he had direct evidence himself. And the King James Version of the Gospel of John includes Jesus saying to Thomas, "Because thou hast seen, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed," which suggests some value in this case to belief in the absence of direct evidence. So by contrast, scientific norms seem to value questioning and certain forms of skepticism. So one example of this comes from Robert Merton, a sociologist of science, who posited 4 idealized norms governing science, and one of them was what he called organized skepticism. So he wrote that whereas most institutions demand unqualified faith, the institution of science makes skepticism a virtue, and that the scientific ethos demands a detached scrutiny of beliefs in terms of empirical and logical criteria. So we set out to test the idea that there were these competing norms of skepticism versus faith across domains by seeing how people interpret the pursuit of inquiry, either in the form of seeking evidence or seeking explanations, across the domains of science and religion. The way we did this in our first studies was that we presented participants with a character who learns about some issue for the first time. And in our first studies, we used near-death experiences or the Shroud of Turin. And we use these because we could describe them in either more scientific terms or in more religious terms. So here's an example involving the Shroud of Turin. You don't have to read through this. The critical thing is that this character learns about the Shroud of Turin for the first time. And in this case, she gets some evidence that suggests that it might have in fact been the burial shroud of Jesus, but there's still some room for ambiguity. And in the religious version, instead of describing religious authorities and scientific authorities and scientific evidence, there would have instead been religious authorities and religious texts offered as evidence. So after getting this information, the character in the vignette, Jen, decides that she does or does not need more evidence that the cloth was the burial shroud that Jesus was wrapped in, or she does or she does not need an explanation for how the shroud came to have its characteristic markings. So the critical thing here is that she either chooses to pursue inquiry, whether it's in the form of evidence or explanation, or she chooses not to pursue inquiry in the form of evidence or explanation. And the difference between evidence and explanation actually turned out to be very minor. So I'm going to be collapsing across that in what I show you. The key thing is, does she decide to pursue inquiry or not to pursue inquiry? We then asked participants to tell us the extent to which they thought that Jen was committed to science and the extent to which she was committed to religion. And we asked this in a few ways, and I'm going to show you collapsed into a single construct. And the difference, as I said, between evidence and explanation was very small, but the difference between pursuing versus foregoing inquiry is really what I want you to focus on. Okay, so here's the data from a first study here. And what you can see here is the extent to which participants inferred that this character, Jen, is committed to science on the left, and the extent to which they inferred that she's committed to religion on the right. And in each case, the data are split up by whether the vignette was framed in more religious or scientific terms, which turned out to not have a very big effect. And we think in part it's because both of the topics were thought of as being more religious in nature by our participants. So what you can see here is that when Jen pursued inquiry, which is represented in the darker gray, she was judged as more committed to science than when she did not. But the flip side of that is that when it came to commitment to religion, we see the reverse effect. Participants inferred that she was more committed to religion when she chose not to pursue inquiry than when she did choose to pursue inquiry. In a follow-up study, we considered inquiry into more canonically scientific topics, like the Big Bang and gravitational waves, but also politically contentious science like GMOs and climate change. So here, if you look on the panel on the left, you'll see that we replicated the results that we found before for commitment to science. So in this case, even pursuing inquiry concerning the scientific consensus on GMOs or climate change was seen as evidence of a stronger commitment to science than abdicating from inquiry, right? So somebody saying, I need more evidence about anthropogenic climate change, that was still seen as a commitment to science. By contrast, in this case, decisions about inquiry concerning science didn't affect inferences about commitment to religion one way or the other. And if you look across all of our studies in this series, what we found is that pursuing inquiry on any matter is taken to signal commitment to science, whereas abdicating from inquiry about religious matters in particular is what's taken to signal commitment to religion. The final studies that I want to present concern ignorance. So specifically, we find that people regard scientific versus religious questions as more strongly demanding an explanation, and religious versus scientific questions as more appropriately explained through mystery versus other forms of ignorance. So in one study, we presented participants with questions from a variety of domains, and these included science and religion. You can see some examples here. And we asked participants first to offer a rating about the extent to which this question could be appropriately answered. It's a mystery. So for example, consider, why is there a God? It's a mystery. Versus, why do continents move? It's a mystery. And we found that on average, mystery claims were more acceptable for religion than for science. That's indicated by the higher values here on the y-axis, with other domains like philosophy falling in between. We also asked participants, to what extent does the question demand an explanation? And here we found that science questions were judged to be in greater need of explanation than questions about religion, again, with other domains like philosophy and psychology falling in between. In follow-up studies, we found the difference between science and religion couldn't be explained just by differing levels of confidence in the premise of each question. So for example, even if you have an individual who believes that God exists with equal confidence to their belief that the continents move, you still find this difference across domains. And we also found that people were more willing to accept mystery claims when they thought the answer to a given question was beyond human comprehension, and when they thought it was a question that people shouldn't try to answer. So it looks like judgments about mystery and explanation reflect our broader assumptions about the nature of each domain. And consistent with the previous work I showed you, for at least some people, religion isn't a potential or appropriate target for inquiry. And ignorance in the form of mystery is sometimes thought to be appropriate. In another study, and this is the last one I'm going to have a chance to share with you today, we explicitly contrasted two different forms of ignorance, declaring something a mystery versus saying that it's unknown. So to do that, we first identified statements about religion and about science, such that a given participant endorsed the statement, but indicated that they didn't know how or why it's the case. So for example, a given participant might indicate that they believe that God answers prayers, but say that they're ignorant about how or why that happens. So this created the conditions that we needed in order for participants to be able to identify what they thought was the right way to express the ignorance that they had about this. And what we did is we gave them an opportunity to choose between 4 ways of expressing their ignorance. They could say either it's a mystery or it's a known. And we also varied the scope of ignorance. So it could either be presented universally like this or personally like this. It's a mystery to me or it's unknown to me. And we found really striking differences across these two domains. So for science, the most common answer was it's unknown to me, which involves unknown rather than mystery, and which is a personal rather than a universal form of ignorance. But for religion, the most commonly selected form of ignorance was it's a mystery, which appeals to mystery versus the unknown, and which is universal rather than personal. In additional studies in the series, we found that when an expert answered it's unknown versus it's a mystery, they were attributed greater curiosity and knowledgeability, which you can think of as being sort of virtues and norms that are consistent with more epistemic goals. And we also found that ignorance in general was regarded as more threatening to science than to religion, with mystery in particular being the most threatening to science. Okay, I know that I've covered a lot quickly. Hopefully I've given you at least a flavor for some of this research. But to review, so here are some 4 key results that I've shown you that suggest that scientific and religious cognition differ in terms of the epistemic and non-epistemic criteria that are used to justify belief, in terms of the epistemic and non-epistemic merits of existential explanations, and in terms of our attitudes towards inquiry and ignorance in these domains. So zooming out, I think this is consistent with the 2 kinds of profile for belief with which I began, with scientific cognition more closely aligned with ideal epistemic belief, and religious cognition more closely aligned with non-epistemic belief. But we've also seen what I think are some actually really important nuances in how different kinds of cognitive attitudes can be shaped by the content of a belief versus its functional role and by the religiosity of a given participant. So if we zoom out even further, there have been lots of proposals in psychology as well as other fields about the nature and origins of scientific and religious cognition, and also about how epistemic and non-epistemic considerations shape motivation and belief. Some of these posit different kinds of cognitive attitudes. So for example, one proposal that's been influential to me is a proposal by Neil Van Leeuwen, where he distinguishes between religious credence as a kind of belief versus what he calls factual belief. There's a long-standing tradition of recognizing different forms of reasoning. So for example, directional versus non-directional motivated reasoning involving different kinds of motivations. And there's also prominent proposals for there being different kinds of modes of cognition. So for example, on Tetlock's social functionalist framework, he suggests that we can operate in an intuitive scientist mode or an intuitive theologian mode, among others. So I think the work that I've presented today combines elements of all 3 of these kinds of approaches in positing different kinds or flavors of belief that are associated with differences in the mechanisms by which beliefs are formed and revised. And I've also motivated from the outset that we can make sense of these profiles for belief and belief revision if we think about the epistemic and non-epistemic functions that these different kinds of forms of cognition serve. And I think both of these kinds of functions are ultimately highly important to be effective and cooperative human agents, right? Ultimately, we want to aim for characterization of all of these components and how they work together. So for now, there are definitely many questions that remain open. And for most of those questions, my answer currently is that it's unknown to me. But we're certainly making progress, and I'm really looking forward to learning more. So I'll end there with thanks again to you for your attention and to the Templeton Foundation for funding most of this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Tania. A very rich talk, both philosophically and psychologically in terms of the psychological science. So people who would like to ask questions, you can either pop them in the chat or you can raise your Zoom hand, and we'll go through. I'll sort of alternate between someone who's got the hand up in Zoom and people who've got got something typed in the chat. I'm going to invoke moderator's privilege and ask the first question, though. So Tania, I want to invite you to speculate a little bit on what you think the etiology of this functional differentiation between sort of broadly religious modes of belief formation and scientific forms of belief formation, where it comes from. And I guess as a sort of ancillary question, do you think that this kind of differentiation is going to show up in samples from outside of the sort of weird part of the world?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I feel like there's multiple levels on which one could give an etiological account. It could be evolutionary, it could involve cultural evolution, it could involve individual learning. I think the one I've probably thought most about are the latter two, rather than biological evolution, more cultural evolution and individual learning. Here's my rough kind of working assumptions here. So I think that we very often are confronted with trade-offs between different kinds of considerations. So just to have a concrete example on the table that comes from other studies that we've done in my lab, suppose that you have some evidence that your best friend committed a crime, and the evidence points to their guilt. What ought you to believe? Ought you to believe that your friend is guilty, or ought you, out of loyalty to your friend, give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're innocent? So that's just one example of a kind of conflict that you might face between epistemic considerations that would just say, follow the evidence, and non-epistemic considerations that might take loyalty into account. I think we face that all the time in all sorts of contexts as people. So how are we going to manage those trade-offs? I think there's probably not a single answer to how we ought to manage those trade-offs that holds across all contexts. And for that reason, we might get a certain kind of flexibility by having different ways of managing those trade-offs that are readily available to us for different kinds of purposes. So that doesn't just apply to science versus religion or scientific versus religious cognition. It's a more general story about one way that is limited cognitive systems, we might handle the fact that we constantly face these kinds of trade-offs. It's by having a kind of, I don't want to say redundancy exactly, but by having multiple capacities that manage these trade-offs differently and having those readily available to apply in given contexts. I think at that level, that story, my bets are, is going to apply cross-culturally, not just to weird societies. I think everyone faces these kinds of trade-offs in lots of cases. I think the specific way that certain things get labeled as scientific versus religious and the specific contrast that I'm looking at in this talk would probably play out somewhat differently in other kinds of cultures that don't differentiate so strongly between those domains. And in particular, contexts in which religion is taken to do a lot more of the work of explaining, describing, and predicting the natural world that in this weird population that I'm studying here is more often attributed to science. So I think it's going to be kind of a mixed bag. Does that give you sort of a flavor for, I mean, I realize that is speculation, right? I don't have the evidence to back that up, but those are my bets, if that makes sense. Oh, you're muted, Alex.
The basic idea is that there's we have a very flexible cognitive system, but the way it sort of gets activated given different belief contents, that might be sort of culturally contingent or something like that.
That's right. That's right. So I wouldn't expect that what I'm labeling science and religion is going to play out the same way across cultures. But I think that there are going to be more epistemic and more non-epistemic kinds of cognitive modes and you're going to find that pretty universally. And in fact, I think it's, even the epistemic, non-epistemic umbrella hides a lot underneath it. I think there's multiple kinds of epistemic considerations that can compete with each other and multiple kinds of non-epistemic considerations that can compete with each other. And so it's going to get, in fact, even more fine-grained, I think.
Okay, I think this is a question in a similar vein. This is from our colleague, Jack. Jack, thanks for your question. I want to make sure that I communicate the substance of it because it's rather long in the chat. But Jack here has asked a question about, I think it's a question about how you end up how you've arrived at the labelings you've given for different kinds of explanation or different kinds of justifications for for the different experiments that you've run. Jack, if you want to clarify your question a little bit, that would be good.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you so much, Professor, for your wonderful talk. This has been something I'm very interested in from a very big picture, is this idea of how do categories affect research, in the sense that, we often talk about dependent, independent variables. But, I've always wondered if, to some degree, do some of the categories we use kind of shape the direction of the field or the knowledge that's generated. And since I noticed from your biography, you've studied categories, and I was hoping, on a meta level to discuss that outside of the scope of this presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a super big and super important question. Thank you. So the part that's relatively easy to answer is how we made the decisions for these studies. And then there's a much broader question that I may or may not have something interesting to say about. So for these studies, so for the original ones where we consider types of justifications, the origins of that research actually came from some qualitative interviews that Emlyn Metz did, where she was talking to people who either considered themselves creationists or who explained human origins in terms of evolution. And of course, some people fell into both of those categories. And she found people spontaneously appealing to different kinds of justifications for belief. And from those qualitative interviews, then tried to develop a more closed-ended instrument to capture those kinds of differences. So that was kind of a combination of bottom up, seeing what you get in the data, but then trying to impose some structure on it, which is a little bit more top down. What we actually do once we start working with those categories is we have the different items that we consider to fall into common categories. And then we can do things like see, well, how strongly do they correlate with each other versus with other categories, using things like factor analysis and so on, to see whether or not it seems like the way I summarize the data for you, where I collapse across groups of items, is capturing the real structure of the data. And in that case, it does capture the structure of the data pretty well. For the studies where we classify explanations as religious versus scientific, this is something that we definitely thought a lot about, right? What counts as a scientific versus a religious explanation? I mean, in fact, I think there are some people who would take all of the explanations we give to be religious insofar as they take them to be true, because they fit part of what they take to be a coherent and unified view of the world. So for that study, we felt like it was actually really important to have the classifications correspond to what our sample, what our participant took to be scientific or religious. And so in that case, we relied on participants' own classifications from the same sample. What do they consider science? What do they consider religion? And so on. For the most part, I think we didn't get huge surprises in the way that classification turned out, but I would certainly not expect that if you took those same explanations cross-culturally, you'd get everybody classifying them in the same way. All I can say with confidence is that we're pretty sure those labels correspond to how our participants understand the scope of those domains, with some differences, right? So for example, I'm pretty sure we did find that participants who were more religious were somewhat broader in what they classified as religious. So that's for those two studies. But I mean, your general question, I think, is obviously a much bigger one and a really, really rich one. All I can say is that in general, I think we try to do a balance of seeing what the data tells us and then trying to impose some partially theoretically motivated structure on it and do some back and forth to see if we can converge on something that seems like it's our, allowing us to make meaningful psychological generalizations.
Thanks, Jack, for your question. We will move on to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nick Gibson, who has a question.
Hi there, Tania.
Hi, Nick.
Thank you for your talk. Just wanted to pivot away from the results of your research for a moment and just thinking about the funding for work like this, and wonder if you'd be willing to share your experience or just reflections that you have on whether it would be possible to get support for this sort of work on religious and scientific beliefs from funders besides any of the Templeton philanthropies. Any experience you've had trying to get funding for this from NSF or other private funders, or just whether you think it's plausible or not?
Yeah, that's interesting. So in my mind, this work is very continuous with other work that I've done that looks at basic mechanisms of belief formation, explanation, learning, and so on. And that other work has received funding from places like the NSF and other private foundations and so on. So I see both bodies of my research, the ones that have been funded by Templeton and the ones that have been funded by non-Templeton, as having the same status in terms of the way that they inform our understanding of cognition. At the same time, I don't think I've even tried to get funding for exactly this type of work framed in these terms from those kinds of organizations. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is that I think I think people are increasingly appreciating that religion and religious belief is an incredibly important scientific phenomenon that we should be studying scientifically. I think that there is appreciation for that. But at the same time, it's a category that kind of falls between the cracks. Is it social cognition? Is it cognitive psychology? Is it developmental psychology, depending on what you're looking at, and so on. And so I think part of what I would think of as a challenge if I were to even try to get funding from one of those mechanisms is there's no particular program that it actually neatly fits into because it cross-cuts so many of those categories. So that would be, I would see as one challenge. Another challenge for the way that I approach this is the fact that philosophy plays a really big role in the way that I think about these issues, in the way that I want to engage with them, and so on. And I think that that's also a challenge. So I've managed to pretty consistently have a philosophy postdoc in my lab, which has been amazing, I think, for everyone in my lab. And the funding for that has come from the Templeton Foundation when I was part of the Varieties of Understanding project, and from the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, right? I don't have NSF money supporting a philosopher in my lab, for example. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think there are definitely challenges. And I think there are challenges to doing it on its own terms, if that makes sense, versus having to situate it more narrowly with respect to recognized traditions in social psychology or cognitive psychology. Does that address the sort of dimensions you were thinking about, or I'm wondering if you had something else in mind?
No, I think that does address it, and I appreciate as well the continuity with other work that you have been doing, but yeah, we certainly hear that it is challenging to get work like this supported elsewhere. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. My colleague Redmond Brubaker is discouraged, so maybe you can help him. He asks, it's discouraging but not surprising that inquiry was seen as hostile to religious claims, or maybe incompatible. Are there some kinds of religious claims for which inquiry is seen as a less hostile, maybe more appropriate sort of attitude to have? And Redmond here speculates that maybe religious people would be more open to inquiry, scientific-like inquiry about character, virtue, growth.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So first I should say, I think it's really important that we did not find inquiry decisions about the Big Bang or gravitational waves to be a signal about religious commitment one way or the other. So it's not the case that there's a general association between hostility to inquiry and religious commitment in our sample. It's specifically choosing not to pursue inquiry about religious matters that was taken as a signal of religious commitment. There's a couple of things that I thought of that are plausible kinds of boundary conditions. So one is, what about curiosity and inquiry related to religious rituals and how you ought to do things, right? Like, what's the right way to observe this service? Like, why do we do it this way rather than another way, and so on? I can imagine that maybe that doesn't have the same reaction. I also expect that you are going to get variation across religious subcommunities here, even in the United States. So one thing that we're thinking of doing but haven't done yet is that my guess is that if you did this on a Jewish population rather than a predominantly Christian one, you would actually find different results there. But one thing, one kind of intuition that I think maybe helps motivate why it's not crazy for people to have that response, if you are discouraged by the fact that people have response, is to think about a more human relationship case, right? So, you might imagine in the context of a relationship, someone says to the other person, I have faith in you, that you're being faithful to me, right? I trust you about this. I don't need to go hire a PI to follow you around in order to feel confident that I can trust you, right? And suppose, I should say, I'm borrowing an example here from Laura Bouchak in a great paper she has on faith, although she uses the example to make a slightly different point. So now suppose somebody says, okay, well, of course you don't want to hire a PI because that's like expensive and awkward, but here, I hired this PI for you for free. I'm going to hire this person to follow around your partner and just confirm that your partner's being faithful to you. you might still think, like, there's still something wrong about like wanting more evidence that my partner is faithful to me, right? Like, part of what it means to trust somebody is to feel that you don't need the extra evidence, right? So here's where I'm departing from the way that Bouchak uses this example. You might think that choosing not to get evidence in that case is actually a way to signal your commitment to somebody in a way that it might actually make that relationship more effective. Right. So in that case of human relationships, I think there's lots of cases where deciding that we don't need further evidence is actually a pretty good signal of commitment or confidence or trust or loyalty or something like that. And what you could be seeing is that same kind of dynamic operating in these other domains where somebody's saying, I'm willing to be part of this community and express my commitment to this aspect of my identity without demanding something further. So I think that's what's going on, but we definitely have many, many more cases that it would be interesting to test, and we haven't yet.
Great. Any more questions from the audience here? We've got about 9 minutes until we're up for time.
I could have presented 5 more studies.
Yeah. Alex, if I may, I was interested in asking Tania the what's next question. So some interesting findings. What intrigued you most, and what are you looking to pursue after this?
Oh gosh, there's so many, I think, open questions here. So some that I've signaled already. I don't think all of this is going to be true of all, even subpopulations in the United States, right? So I think there's definitely work to be done to find out how this relates to particular aspects of communities. There's a lot of work that we've already done that I just didn't get to present. So you'll have to, you can wait for the papers on that. They're coming soon. I think one thing that I'd really like to get a better sense for is how the 3 pieces I mentioned fit together. So one piece of this has to do with the nature of belief. Like, what are beliefs? Are there different kinds of beliefs? What are the flavors of beliefs? Then what are the mechanisms involved in belief formation and belief revision, right? Basically what we think of as reasoning often, although there might also be many unconscious processes that are involved there as well. And then there's the kind of functionalist story I want to tell about the epistemic and non-epistemic goals that we're accomplishing by virtue of our beliefs and our reasoning systems. And so I'd really like to be able to integrate all of those parts better, to do something like what I did here a little bit, where I start out saying, like, well, if you wanted a system that accomplished this, what are the implications for the beliefs and the reasoning that would be involved for that system? And to be able to have the whole package kind of rationally motivated. And to do that for other kinds of epistemic and non-epistemic concerns, and then to think about how they interact. One thing that we've started thinking about already is how to get more fine-grained than what I've presented here, right? So I just gave you I think kind of the first buckets of epistemic and non-epistemic. One thing that we see that's really interesting within the kind of non-epistemic bucket is some set of things that seem to have a very social or moral kind of dimension, and some set of things that seem to be much more about your identity and your sense of self and how you think about yourself. And I think those might be really different. So we're seeing hints in our data that maybe that's its own category. And so I really want to think more about, if we get a more fine-grained taxonomy, what does that look like? So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. There's, I could go on, and I'm happy to, but those are some of the big ones. I suppose another big one in general is, insofar as we do see these kinds of patterns of effects, it'd be really nice to see how they play out over longer periods of time, right? So insofar as people have different kinds of attitudes towards inquiry, what does that mean over time for the evidence that they're actually going to seek, for how they're going to actually update their beliefs? What are going to be the downstream consequences of these kinds of attitudes if you look not 10 minutes into an experiment, but really longer term? And that's a really hard question to address with many of these beliefs, because they're not the kinds of beliefs that you can move around easily.
Yeah, all of that is very much of interest to the foundation, in the sense that, part of our charge is to encourage people to be more open-minded, especially to spiritual realities. And so we have a fundamental theory of change challenge in front of us, which is greater understanding of this belief revision, how it changes over time, and how we then might even go about encouraging others to become more open. So absolutely something that's on our minds as well.
We have time for maybe one more question if someone wants to take it. If not, I have a question, but I want to yield the time to anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet.
I have one, which is perhaps embarrassingly ignorant, but that's what I'll do anyway. I'm curious how attitudes of inquiry relate to actual practice. And I know that that doesn't sound like what you're investigating, but what does it mean to have an attitude toward certain kinds of inquiry in terms of what you actually, how you approach knowledge and your own beliefs?
Yeah, that's a great question. The truth is, in terms of my data, we only have like the tiniest little bits of that. I mean, the thought is that it's going to affect things like the questions you ask of others, the kind of evidence that you seek in your environment, and how you update your beliefs in light of that. And so all we really have in terms of evidence so far is that we do find that the kinds of measures that we use, where we ask people how curious they are about something or the extent to which something demands an explanation, that does predict which information they will choose to have revealed later, right? So if you later have an opportunity to have a subset of questions answered, you're going to choose to have the subset answered, which is the one for which you felt the greatest curiosity or the greatest need for explanation. So we do know it translates into behavior just kind of at that first step. But what does that really mean downstream over time as a person makes decisions about how they allocate their time and attention and so on? I think that's a super important question that my research hasn't really addressed. I think one place where I think you're starting to see more of this in terms of how it plays out over time in real world contexts is in the context of social media and exposure to news and fake news in particular. I think in that context, people are starting to see more about what does online behavior look like over time in terms of what people are choosing to expose themselves to. And I think that's one domain where it's easier to see how you might get the relevant data to do analyses, whereas studies where you follow people around for their entire lives and get a sense about which questions they ask and what evidence they expose themselves to is obviously sort of like too big to be empirically tractable. But I think that line of research might be really helpful in thinking about how what we're studying might play out in the real world.
Great. Well, Tania, I'm just going to ask the last questions. Hopefully it's a fun one for you. But suppose you were given $5 million to make grants with on any subject within psychological science or philosophy for that matter, but subject to the following conditions. It can't be your own research. And it's got to be something that you take yourself not to actually know that much about. What would you spend that $5 million on?
Oh gosh. All right. So at each point there, I thought I had answers until you added the the restrictions. Okay. Well, I'm gonna cheat a little bit, but I think it's only a little bit. So I think a really big question that I'm thinking about, as are many, many people, I'm sure, including the foundation, is how do you get people to be better thinkers? That's a huge question. I think people on the empirical side often don't appreciate all of the normative dimensions that are packed into even asking the question and thinking about it. And so I think within that, which I do take myself to work on, but I think a pocket of it that I don't work on is how do we think about that in terms of something like formal education? And again, it's an area where I really think you need really sophisticated normative philosophical work alongside really sophisticated understanding of development and learning mechanisms and behavior change and all sorts of things, right? And so the sort of thing I'm imagining is trying to lay out a very broad conception of what it is that you'd have as a goal for education, what it means to be a good thinker in a really broad sense, and then how do you implement that? So that's one thought. If I had more time to think about it, I could probably come up with many more and perhaps articulate them better. But certainly that's something that it ranks very high in my mind in terms of things that matter.
Great. Well, you could probably spend way more than 5 million on that. So anyway, it is noon on the dot. Tania, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And we really appreciate your time. And yeah, everyone else, thanks again for being attentive and listening and for asking some questions. And hopefully you guys came away with a better understanding of some of the differences between scientific and religious modes of reasoning. So with that, I don't know who pushes the end button on this. I'm not going to do it.
Well,
My hands are
thanks to all of you again for coming, and thanks